RubyMine has this nice feature called To Do, and it shows up here on the bottom, and it searches all of your code base to find out anywhere you've put a to-do item. Because when we're working in Rails especially, we're working on so many different files at the same time, right? We've got the view, the controller, the routes file, some of our helpers are open, and so we've got lots of stuff open all the time. And what we can do is we think about, hey, I need to think about this issue, so I can put a comment in my code, to do, and say, remember to validate the email, so that I don't forget it at the time I'm writing my code. And then when I go to my to-do box here, it says, it searches all my code and it finds all these to-dos for me, tells me exactly where it is. I can double click on it and it takes me to that piece of code. And I can remember, and this is done a lot in the real world as well, because when you start working on Rails projects, they get to be lots of files, lots of models, lots of views, lots of controllers, and to try to remember all this stuff, it's better just put it in the code and then search for these to-dos. So that's why RubyMine put it into their program itself, because it's a common practice among programmers. No, I mean, it's just a comment. And when you're done with it, you take it out. I fixed that problem. Take it out. And now the to-do database gets updated, and I don't have any to-dos left. So it's just a nice tracker of things to have to deal with later on.
Bug checks and things like that.
Yeah.
A lot of times. I've seen that similar things used where one person will just run through your code.
Yeah.
And they constantly put to-dos in your code.
Yeah, fix this, fix this, fix this.
Work off your to-do list.
Yes, yeah, that's very, very possible. All right, today we're going to talk about models. So far we've talked about the view and the controller pretty heavily. So the request comes from the browser, goes to what?
To the controller.
It goes to the routes and then the controller, right? Then from the controller does some stuff, makes some variables, and then it sends all of its information to the view, and the view sends all the information back to the browser. All right, so the model is squeezed in there. If we look at the original, let me find my nice little document here. That's not it. Here's my stuff that I did not record. Here's the picture from the book where the browser sends a request to the controller. The controller may or may not go out and access the model, which in turn accesses the database. So this whole part here is optional, as you've seen. All the stuff we've done so far did not require a model. And then that interaction goes back to the controller, and we go back to the view and comes back to the information to the browser. All right, so, yes?
It's just that little dashed arrow from the view. What is that?
We can bypass the controller and go from the view and say, I want to look at a particular product, and it will go and fetch it from the model. But that's not done very often. Most of the time, the controller sets a variable with data that it retrieves from the model, and then the view uses that variable to go get it. But I can't go directly from the view and go get data. It kind of bypasses the, while it's possible, it's not good practice. All right? So that's the model. So we're going to start just by playing around with a model in the console. And this also gives you some practice in the console. I want you to play around more in the console. So first of all, we need to create a model. So Rails has those generators. Remember, we generated views and we generated controllers and etc. I want to generate, using the Rails generator, I want to generate a model. All right? So from RubyMine, I go to Tools, Run Rails generator, which I just lost my... I lost what I typed. If I have nothing here, you can see all of these things that I could actually create with the generator. And model is what I want. So I type the first couple letters, model, and it comes up with a box of all the options that I have. Now, a model requires a model name. Now, a model is tied very closely to the database structure. Each model that we create is tied to a specific database table. Every table requires a new model. And you'll see that mapping is got to be one-to-one. We have one model to one table. So you have all had SQL, right? So the first, it tells you what the arguments are up here. First of all, I need the model name. And the model name becomes a class in Ruby. So we use camel case naming conventions for our models, right? And we typically use a singular noun for the table, like product, or blog, or recipe. We don't use plurals. We use a singular when we're creating the table. All right, so I'm going to call one recipe. So that's the name. That will end up being the name of my class. And then I have the different fields. Now, each field is a column in my table. So you have to think about what do I need in my table that I'm going to create. And we name them similar to SQL. I'm going to say I'm going to have the name of my recipe, and I use a colon, and I separate the name and what type of variable is going to be stored in that column. All right? In this case, it's going to be a string. All right? And I might have a, how many people does it serve, this particular recipe? And that's going to be a number. And I'm going to say it's an integer. All right? Ingredients is a long bunch of text maybe, so I'm going to call that a text. Maybe a made by is going to be what? A string, okay, the name of the person. And then I might have when I last made this recipe. So I could say like last made, and what type of data would be stored in that column? A date, okay, so I'm going to put a date, time instead, so I can actually have the time. I could use date or date time, just like in SQL. All right, so what I've defined here are the names of the columns and the data that's stored in each one of them. Yes?
Does the generator automatically make an ID?
Yes, you'll see that. Yes, absolutely does. An image. Okay, so an image would be maybe we've got to have a picture of our food, right? So,
do you want to store it as a blob or a string?
So typically I like to store stuff out of the database. So I store them as a file on the database, on the file system, and a string, which is a path name to that image. So that's going to be a string. All right? These are the defaults to not do any of this, so we can skip all of this. You'll see when we create this that it automatically adds some other fields, like an ID, a primary key, which is the ID of that record. It also adds a timestamp when it was created and when it was modified or updated. So they have a created at and an updated at field that get created automatically. What was that?
Why wouldn't you not want that?
Yeah, sometimes you don't. So if it's a very simple model, you might only have two fields or something. So I'm going to say, okay, And Rails does its magic and runs the code. It's actually code that's going to produce code. And it's going to create some files for me. If it ever comes back up. Yeah, questions while I'm waiting for this.
Is when you generate a model, so they don't create a table for you, though, right? Real.
They will. Yes. Yes, it will create a table for you in your database.
Okay, where's the database?
All right, so we'll get to that. Relax. So these are the files that get created when I ran the generator. This is all, the models are all from a class called Active Record. And it creates this migration file, which we'll talk about in a second. It creates a new file in the models directory in my app. And it creates some tests, which we're not going to do right now. So if I look at my app here, I have this folder called models. And now I have a Ruby file called recipe.rb. And recipe is a class that inherits from active record base, just like the view inherited from the application controller. I mean, the controller inherited from the application controller. This gives me lots of methods automatically because of that inheritance. There's a large set of code in the active record that ties the names of my columns into variables that I can play with. And that's called Object Relational Mapping, ORM, so that when I access a row in my table, that's one record, right? When I access that, it associates a variable name with each of those pieces automatically for me. And as you'll see, that makes it really nice to code here. I don't usually ever have to write SQL when I'm in Rails. It does it all for me. And it does it all for me based on the database that I have associated with my Rails project. In this case, my database uses the default. If I go back to my DB folder now, this DB folder is where my database is actually stored. For development purposes, the default that Rails comes up with is this SQLite 3. So this is a flat file, single file database that doesn't have any access required. It's very simple. It uses the same SQL commands as like MySQL. So it's very easy to deal with. I don't have to worry about setting up a connection to the MySQL database and all that kind of stuff. So for development, it's real quick and dirty. When I move to production, I can change the database underneath that to go to a MySQL database, for instance. And all my code doesn't have to change. I don't have to change anything because the interface is already created between Rails and MySQL, and my methods, that ORM, is inserted between the Rails project and the actual database calls. So it interprets what I want and creates the correct SQL statement to go out and get the data for me, as you'll see here in a second.
Wouldn't that only apply if your Ruby project, your local file, was an exact replica of your SQL table?
Well, when you move to production, you can generate the exact same tables from the Ruby code that I'm creating now. So it will create the tables as necessary in a MySQL database. I'm not going to take my development database. This is the actual database here.
Right.
I'm not going to take that to production. It will regenerate a whole new set of tables, whole new set of initial data and everything.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
So when I create a model, the later on I want to add some more column. So then do I need to regenerate? Or
No, we'll get to that probably next week. We can add a migration to add data to our tables. I can add columns, and that's where we're getting to right now, is this migration. Okay, so this is the model. This is the class. It's a Ruby class, and it has one method that it gave us, and this is new in Rails 3.2.8, where it actually writes this line of code for you. In the past, this whole line wasn't here, and that was your entire model. All right, so they put this in here because people were having trouble with it. After accessible means that all of these fields, these are the different fields in my table, or columns in my table, are going to be allowed to be set from a mass, what they call a mass assignment call. We'll get to that later. So this is just, each one of these now, this is the name of the column. So these end up being methods that I can call to get at the data for a particular record, as you'll see in a second. Yes?
Now, if, let's say, your database had another column you didn't call here, would you be able to access it at all?
No, you would have to have your model. If you had an existing database that you're going to try to attach a Rails project to, you're going to have to make your model fit the existing table. Yeah. So that's what we're getting to. So the migration is, it creates this code for me that I'm going to run in a minute. And what this does is it defines how a table is created. So it calls this method called create table. And the name of the table is going to be recipes. Now notice that it pluralized my recipe when I first created it. It decides when to use plural versus singular. And you'll see some of that as we write some code. But it changed. I put recipe when I created the model. It changed it to recipes. All right? So each recipe is going to have a name column, which is a string, a serves column, which is an integer, etc. So it defines all of those fields that I typed in. And in addition to that, it creates a timestamps. This is another method that creates two columns, a created at date and time and an updated at create and time. So every time, if I create a new record, that those columns get updated automatically for me. Those that did PHP with me know that we'd like to add those fields, but we had to manage them ourselves. They were quite painful to deal with, right? Rails does it all for us. We don't have to worry about that. And in addition to that, it creates a field that we don't see here, which is the ID, which is an auto increment, not null, unique column, starting with 1. And it auto increments every time I create a new record. It'll auto increment, and that's the way I get at the data from my table. All right, so this is just code, and the reason they separate, they don't actually run this for you. You have to do this in 2 steps. I have to generate the model, and then I have to run the model this migration code to actually create the table for me.
Where is that migration?
It's in the DB folder, the database folder where my database is, and it has another folder called migrations. So,
I never saw you open that folder, so.
oh, sorry. So this is the file that was automatically generated by my rake task to create, my generate task to generate this model. And what does this number look like to you at the front here? It's a date timestamp, 2012, 10, 18, 15, 55, 12. Okay? So 18 is today's date. It's on the 18th. But it shows 15, which is, right, these are all based on Greenwich Mean Time. So this is generated with this timestamp in the name, because if you're working with multiple developers, they're all generating models and you're all doing all this stuff. When you run a migration, then the Rails goes from the oldest migration up to the newest migration. So it has to run them in order, because one migration might modify a previous table. Like you might add a column to a table, and we do that through creating another migration. All right? So all of these timestamps are very important. This tries to eliminate where 2 developers create a migration at the same time. It's very rare that they're going to be exactly the same second. So that keeps your code, when you're sharing code across version control systems and things like that. That's why the timestamp is here. It'd be pretty tough. We'll get to that. So this is what we can run. I can add some things. I can add some constraints to my table, make it not null. I can do some of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that right now. And I would do that by modifying my text right here. All right. So to run this migration, I run a new task, which is a rake task. And we are going to say run the DB tasks. There's a bunch of DB tasks. And I want to say DB migrate. Migrate the database. Rails then keeps track of what version has been migrated already. So when I run this, it's going to actually execute this code, do all of the SQL commands necessary for my SQLite 3 database to create a table with all these fields, and at the end of this, I'll have a blank database with one table in it.
Okay, so,
all right? Yeah.
So if you were attaching this to a pre-existing table, then this is a step you would not do because that table already exists.
Right. All right, so that's coming along. So it tells me I created a table called recipes. It took so many seconds. It's migrated. Now, if I try to migrate that again, if I run this again, it says it keeps track of the last migration that was executed, and it will not execute it again, so it's not going to create my table again. Yeah. No, you can, but you have to drop the table and rerun this migration. The better solution, which is more Railsy, is to create a new migration that only changes the table. So we're going to run a migration that does an alter table kind of thing, like in SQL. I can alter a table to add a column. We're going to do the same thing where we're going to add a column, and there's some simple code for that. But you see that it didn't actually do anything. It actually created in the database a field, a table that shows what all the migrations have been run, and it keeps track of the last one. So that's why the timestamp is also very important. All right, so now my table is created. It's actually in this database, this development.SQLite 3. And it also, because I ran a migration for the first time, it created this schema.rb. All right, this is a file that is automatically generated based on all of the migrations that I have. As we get through the quarter, you'll have an articles table and a products table and a blogs table and a users table and all these kind of different tables. This will show all of the different things that you can read, which is like a database dump, but it's all in Ruby. So you can see the actual date and time fields here and all of my custom fields that I have here. It doesn't show the ID because that's a standard across all of the tables. So that's just something you can reference. You never modify this file. That's just showing you the current state of your database. All right, so without getting into the browser and all of that, we're going to play with the console so that we can create data in our table. And these commands that I'm going to show you are what we would actually do in perhaps our controller. When somebody hits a link to say create a new product, it's going to go to our products controller and execute the code like I'm going to type here in the console. So there's lots of commands that let us do that. So I need to run the console. Under Tools, Run Rails Console. And I like to, it takes a little bit to come up, so I like to do this just to see when that finally comes back and says 4, I know that the console's loaded. It's just a habit that I have because it takes a few seconds. Sleeping, pausing. Come on. There we go. See, finally came up. came up, evaluated my code. Now this is, the Rails console is an extension of the IRB interpreter, the interactive Ruby console that we've shown in the last classes. So I can do just simple things like A equals 2 plus 2, and now A is a variable that is created in this environment that I can use to multiply. So I can save variables. And I can also now play with my model. So the model is, if I just type recipe is the name of my model, and it comes back with a representation of what that looks like. So recipe has an ID. That's the auto increment, not null, unique table column that Rails added to me. That's my primary key. It's also a primary key. It's indexed, so that's all happy there. I've got my name, my serves, my ingredients, and this is all done in the new Ruby 193 representation of a hash. This is the same ID colon integer is the same thing as saying this. All right, hash rocket ID hash rocket integer. This is a new shortcut way of describing a hash. I don't know. I don't like it just because I'm used to the old way, but this is. It's hard to type. Yeah, sure.
So can you, in 193, is it also possible to define a hash using that?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I can say there's some methods. I can say I want to create a new record. All right, and I'm going to start to define. Remember when we created a new DVD class or a new character class last quarter? Yeah. We called the init or the new method, right? We said model.new, and that went through and we passed some data through that new method, and it got put into the instance variables of that particular object, right? So this is the same thing. I'm going to create a new record, and I need to pass it some information, like what is the name going to be of this recipe? Well, it's Dave's, I got to put it in double quotes, Dave's ribs, all right? And I can say it serves 4. I can, but I'm too used to the old way. I can say ingredients. And what type of field was ingredients? It was text. It says right here. So I could have a long string, right? Like ribs, sauce, whatever.
Spices.
And I'm not going to fill in some of these others here just to show you what happens. So when I hit return, it doesn't like name. Why not? Ah. All right. So this is the name is not a Ruby construct. I have to make this either a string or in Rails we do it as a symbol, right? So that was stupid. So I say my name is going to be Dave's Ribs, and we use symbols a lot in Rails. So symbols and strings are, in most cases, interchangeable. All right, there we go. So it actually did the command. Those are the values. I didn't pass everything. So this tells me what the SQL did. It said insert into recipes, that's the table, these values, created at, image, ingredients, last made, yada, yada, yada. And the values, question, created at, those were generated for me. My image was nil. My ingredients had this value in it, ribs. My last made was nil because I didn't pass it. And all of those values. So updated at was automatically generated for me. So that's the SQL that got generated and executed for me when I called my recipe.create. Isn't that nice? I didn't have to do any of that in that SQL stuff. So now it returned an object. Remember in Ruby, when we did an inspect on an object, it kind of told us what class it came from. So it returned a value here of a recipe object that has these different values associated with that recipe. So this particular recipe number 1 has a name attribute that has Dave's Ribs in it, etc. So it's all committed to my database. I can now do some things to retrieve that. I didn't happen to save that information. So the only way to get that back now is to query the database and save that. So I can save things in my in variables. So I can say store the following statement in my A variable, and I'm going to say recipe.find, and I can give it the unique ID of the record that I just created. So I can say find me number 1. So now A, it did the select. That converted into a SQL command, select recipes.star from recipes where recipe.id equals limit 1, ID 1, and it found my that one row in my table. Isn't that nice? So I don't have to worry about any more SQL like all of that. That just does it for me. Now, A is what type of an object? It's a recipe object, right? So it is a custom object that has attributes to it that actually is mapping directly to that record in the database. So I can say a.name, and what do you think that's going to return? Dave's Ribs, right? A.serves is going to be 4, which is an actual integer type, right? So a.name.class, if I do that, it should come back as a string. That column is a string that's holding my name data. A.ingredients. I can. A.id gives me the unique ID of the data. I can say A.created at, created at, tells me a date timestamp of when that record was created. Isn't that cool? So my little object now, I can get at that data. I could use that in a view, for instance, and print out the recipe on the page, put some divs around it, etc. I can modify my record now. If I just look at my A, remember that my made by was nil. So I can say a.made by, and notice RubyMine comes back and says there are 2 methods for that. Remember the attra accessor, the attra writer, attra reader, that automatically created a getter and a setter for the elements that I had in my class. Now you remember why I sent you through all that class stuff. This is why we do it, is for this model stuff. So I can either look at the data, I can say a.made by, and that's a nil, or I can say equals Dave. So now if I look at my A object, my made by is over here by Dave, right? But it's only saved in memory right now. If I want to commit this to the database, I have to call a method called save on the object. So I can call a.save. That does the actual commit or an update to that record, and it does the SQL. So update record set recipe made by updated at. So it modified my updated at timestamp and my made by, because it noticed that those are the only 2 values that changed. So it figured out the SQL on how to update that record for me. Isn't that nice? So now if I look at my A again, A has everything in it. I've got my made by. My last modified is last made. I don't have anything set there. So I can do the same. A.made, last made. And notice that RubyMine already knows all of these new methods that were created for me. So this is a field name, but it's also a method of a getter and a setter for this database record. So I could set that to time.now, right? So now I can save it again, and it does the update. It says set the last made to this timestamp, and it modifies my updated at again because my record has changed. Isn't that sweet? Just automatically does that for me. It's black magic stuff. All right, so that's we'll do some more creation of these tomorrow. Now Monday, and we'll do some looking at how to retrieve the data from the table. So I want you to look on the Rails guides. There are a couple of things that I want you to read. This database migrations. If you read this entire guide on database migrations, that's very good. And then the active record query interface. Don't do these two yet. Those are more complicated. This active record query interface tells me how to do the find method, for instance, that I had.
So read that by Monday?
Yes.
Okay.
So read those two guides. All right, any questions?
Do we have to?
Yes, you have to. All right, quitting.